So I'm excited to welcome our first speaker, Brie Winnega. She's a doctoral student in the Department of English at the University of Texas at Austin. And in her dissertation work, she studies the concepts of care ethics and disability rights in contemporary nursing memoirs. And I guess this is also what she will be talking to us about work directly related to her thesis. And her talk today is entitled, "I've Seen So Many Deaths, COVID-19 Nursing Testimony as Literary Caretaking." Brie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I just want to thank you both for hosting us and opening up the space to talk about some of the many challenges and insights this past year and a half has brought. Let me share my screen and please let me know if it works out okay. Okay, thank you. So I'm tuning in from Austin, Texas, where I'm going into my 5th year as a doctoral student in English at the University of Texas at Austin. My research examines contemporary memoirs written by nurses here in the US, specifically focusing on the ethics of care that emerge from such texts and the degree to which an autobiographical work by a nurse might be considered a form of caretaking in itself. As you'll see from my presentation, the parameters of this paper have very much been informed by the parameters of my dissertation, which take nurses as its primary subject for many reasons, including their close proximity to their patients, their unique positions within the hierarchy of medical institutions, and the relative lack of critical attention paid to their writing compared to texts produced by physicians. Many nurses in the US remain overworked and undercompensated, performing various and important types of caretaking that doesn't always garner adequate acknowledgement, including labor related to patient advocacy. So that brings me to the topic of my paper for today, COVID-19 Nursing Testimony as Literary Caretaking. The argument I wish to make during this presentation is that we can find examples of literary caretaking in the op-eds, photographs, poems, interviews, and other forms of autobiographical texts created by nurses in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis. In my presentation, I will offer various forms of what I'm considering nurse testimonies, and I will argue that it's worth reconceptualizing these testimonies as forms of care so that we can explicitly acknowledge them as extension of these nurses' already overwhelming caretaking labor. This research is somewhat preliminary in terms of my larger effort to theorize autobiographical texts by nurses as instances of literary caretaking. The language of literary care that I'm using comes from a 2003 article by Catriona D'Amour, which analyzes AIDS narratives written by doctors. D'Amour identifies these narratives as, quote, a literary form of care which bears witness to the lives, particularities, stories, and deaths of persons with AIDS. In the article, D'Amour writes that the caring responsibilities of a doctor do not cease with the death of a patient. In fact, I would argue that these doctors extend their responsibility of caring for patients in their role of companion to their moral responsibility as authors, i.e., taking care of the memories of patients in their role of witness. You can see that the argument I'm making here is in many ways an extension of D'Amour's. Testimonies by COVID-19 nurses can qualify as an extension of those nurses' efforts to provide care in the wake of a fatal illness that scientists have yet to fully understand. This language of literary caretaking is not one that I've yet been able to find other scholars using. And I find it important to note too, that what I mean by literary caretaking differs ideologically from the phrase narrative medicine, a phrase with which many of you are no doubt familiar. Narrative medicine, in Rita Sharon's definition, uses narrative to inform clinical practice. And indeed, an article from the summer of 2020, published by the Los Angeles Times, is an excellent example of medical doctors describing the importance of narrative principles in supporting their work during the COVID-19 crisis. A main difference between narrative medicine and literary caretaking, as I'm conceptualizing it, is that narrative medicine is used to inform clinical encounters. What I'm interested in with this project is how narratives by care providers might transcend the clinical space. A space which unfortunately can be markedly violent for people who experience racism, sexism, transphobia, or most recently, isolation and a lack of access to resources such as ventilators and ICU space. My question is as follows. In a moment of crisis marked by resource scarcity, staff shortages, and so much uncertainty and fear, how might literature function as a continuation of the caretaker's labor? In wading through as many published pieces as I could find that have been written by or about American nurses during the COVID-19 crisis, I find that there does not appear to be a unifying exigency behind each instance of testimony. Some of the publications seek to teach, embracing a distinctly pedagogical purpose, such as this piece called Dying 101. Others seek to testify to the traumatic circumstances in which our nurses have been placed, bearing witness to the shortcomings of our healthcare system, and in some cases of individual institutions. And others embrace a more political exigency, using testimony from what they've witnessed to pursue a rhetorical goal. And some are doing many of these things at once. I want to turn to my first example of testimony emerging from the COVID-19 crisis. This example was a large part of the initial inspiration for this project. The article I'm presenting on screen comes from a November 16th publication by Insider. And the author, Ashley Coleman, is reporting on the testimony of a travel nurse named Lawana Rivers, who posted a Facebook Live video on November 7th, describing the atrocious conditions of a hospital in El Paso, Texas. In the video, Rivers says, quote, "Out of all the COVID assignments I've been on, this one here has really left me emotionally scarred. The facility I'm at has surpassed the one I was at in New York." In the video, Rivers describes something called the pit, where COVID patients are placed and where Rivers states doctors refuse to enter. She states that patients who do receive treatment at the hospital are treated inadequately, while one patient who was the wife of a doctor receives ample treatment. Rivers goes on to say, quote, "The morgue was so full of bodies that they had run out of room. So once the doors open to the pit, they come wheeling in a body already in a bag, line them up with the rest of our alive patients because they had to store the body in there because the morgue was out of room," end quote. In one moment that stands out to me, Rivers says, quote, "I have never experienced and have no words for what I just experienced in El Paso, Texas." In the first chapter to a book co-authored with Dory Lobb, Shoshana Fellman defines testimony as a discursive practice, writing that what testimony does not offer is a completed statement, a totalizable account of those events. In testimony, language is in process and in trial. It does not possess itself as a conclusion, as the constatation of a verdict or the self-transparency of knowledge, end quote. This video from Lawana Rivers is in many ways an expression of trauma, of not yet having the words to describe the effects of her own experience. And it is also, to me, an explicit rendering of the labor of testimony, which demands an intense and often painful engagement from the speaker so that others can be brought to bear witness secondhand. As Leah Gilmore writes in her essay entitled Testimony, when violence is part of what happened, then testimony must be part of what's next. We can theorize Lawana Rivers' testimony as an act of caretaking in that it honors the lives of those patients who were subject to the hospital's malpractice and who cannot testify about their own mistreatment. In my attempts to define what constitutes an act of care, I draw upon scholars of feminist care ethics such as Evelyn Nakano-Glenn, who writes that caring can be defined most simply as the relationships and activities involved in maintaining people on a daily basis and intergenerationally. Here, I argue that Lawana Rivers' testimony is a performance of care precisely because it maintains people, or at least attempts to maintain people, by asserting their personhood in the face of inhumane treatment. She does this, for example, when she rebukes the doctors who chose which lives to value based on their personal affiliations. She takes care of the memories of patients, as Damore writes, by confronting and publicizing the horrible circumstances of their final moments. Rivers' testimony cannot, of course, undo the horrible experiences of those patients. As Sandra Gilberts writes in her 1999 essay, Writing Wrong, you can't write wrong by writing wrong, even though you are engaged in the writing even though you are engaged in the writing because consciously or unconsciously, you believe your testimony will reverse, repair, or undo the wrong you're reporting. Nevertheless, although the wrong cannot be undone or repaired, the literary care performed by testimonials such as Rivers makes it more difficult to sweep such wrongs under the rug. In making public what otherwise would have remained private, I argue that Rivers takes care of her patients by advocating against and shedding light upon the circumstances in which they died. The same argument might be made for a piece from the Washington Post in April 2020, which includes the first-person testimony of an ER nurse named Michaela Sakal. In her testimony, Sakal recounts her experience working for a hospital in Detroit during the pandemic and her eventual decision to quit after several failed attempts to convince hospital administrators to hire more staff. This testimony employs several key devices that work to convey the urgency and trauma of the experience and to bring the audience in close proximity to the events she describes. For example, we can see the use of the second person throughout this first excerpt. You need to be everywhere at once. That's how it feels. You don't go to the bathroom, you don't eat. You're lucky if you find time in a 12-hour shift to get water. You spend every minute moving from patient to patient, trying to keep them stable and alive. The phones ring all the time, and it might be a family member asking for an update, but you look at the number, and if it isn't a doctor, you honestly don't have time. We might read this strategy as an implicit invitation for the reader to imagine themselves in such a scenario. The audience is literally being inserted into the narrative of Sakal's testimony, and in some sense asked to bear witness to the trauma of the emergency room during this time. We can also observe this testimony employing short sentences in sequence, a tool that formulates the narrative in such a way that performs the very urgency described by the content of the testimony. Sakal says, alarms are going off every minute, pump alarms for the patient's life-sustaining medications, monitor alarms, oxygen alarms, heart rate alarms. Some beep, some chime, some ring. Every one could mean a crisis. The form that this description takes is such that the pace of the testimony speeds up for a moment. It's almost as if the reader is being made to experience themselves the maddening urgency of so many alarms. Again, we're being made to a secondhand witness via the testimony of this ER nurse. Returning to my original question, I remain curious as to whether we can consider Sakal's testimony to be a form of caretaking. Her text is doing much of the same work that Luana Rivers' video appears to be doing, creating an implicit call for accountability. She details not only the demands such circumstances have made on her, the caretaker, but also the consequences of such circumstances for the patients, whose alarms continue to sound without adequate response from an understaffed hospital. In doing so, Sakal speaks to what Karen Foley, professor of nursing at Purdue, calls insufficient resource trauma. She, like Rivers, names her institution, the Sinai Grace Hospital in Detroit, which she feels should be held responsible for her colleagues, and her patients' trauma. Her claim that it was impossible is, in brief, an indictment of her hospital's failure to provide adequate staffing, treatment resources, and personal protective equipment, all while demanding the impossible of their existing staff. Where I think we can see testimonies like Sakal's differ slightly from Luana Rivers' Facebook Live video is that Sakal memorializes individual patients within the space of her testimony. This gesture to recount memories of one's personal interactions with patients is one that I encounter frequently in my study of long-form memoirs published by nurses, but that appears to be far more rare in the shorter online publications from the past year in response to COVID-19. The sense I get from analyzing these COVID-19 nursing testimonies is that the urgency of moving constantly with very little, if any, time to connect with one's patients is often an integral part of the trauma of nursing during the pandemic. Sakal's testimony does speak to this element of her experience, and I maintain that it's worth considering the descriptions of insufficient resources and the effects of resource scarcity on nurses and patients alike as part of the caretaking endeavor of her testimony. But it's also important to acknowledge the emotional labor of excerpts such as this, in which Sakal relates what she experienced in the moments leading up to her patient's death. It was maybe 5 o'clock in the morning. I was responding to alarms and trying to keep an oxygen mask on one lady who was confused and kept wanting to take it off, even though her life depended on it. And meanwhile, this other patient was in a room pretty far out of sight because we didn't have any other space. His blood pressure medication must have run out. I didn't know about it until Joey came back and started yelling to grab more medication and call the doctor, but it was too late. This patient had come from a nursing home and he was a lot older. He was incredibly sick. It's a lot to process. There's sadness and guilt and so much anger at the situation, but we had to keep moving. We had to do the afterlife care and there were other alarms going off. I will return to this excerpt in a moment, but for the sake of adding one more testimony into the mix, I want to pair this passage from Sakal's text with photographs from another COVID nurse. These photos come from a collection by Karen Cunningham, an ICU nurse at Lenox Hill Hospital in Manhattan. The pictures I'm interested in for this discussion are of these two unnamed patients, one of whom is being intubated while the other is on oxygen after coming off a ventilator. I'm pairing these three moments together because in my reading, they each function as a snapshot of individual patients. They recount a specific moment in time for each of their subjects. And while one could argue that to a certain extent, the patients are being memorialized via these snapshots, each of the subjects is anonymous. We know very little about the figures featured in these testimonies, such that they come to represent the hundreds of thousands who've died from COVID here in the US alone. In presenting these examples to you, I'm suggesting that Sakal's written testimony and Cunningham's photograph testimony are working on multiple levels in terms of what Damore defines as, quote, the sort of witnessing that is constructed implicitly or explicitly as an extension of practices of care and a continuation of the caring process. In her article, Damore argues for the moral responsibility of the AIDS physician to take care of the memories of their patients. And I'm not convinced that this is exactly the type of labor Sakal's or Cunningham's testimonies are performing. After all, we are given very little information about this man in Sakal's text, an older patient from a nursing home. And in effect, the patient's identity in each of these snapshots remains somewhat anonymous. In the photo on the left, the angle is such that we're not given access to the patient's face. Moreover, in both photos, the patients being captured are out of focus. The sharpest elements of each photo are the side of the nurse's covered head on the left and the woman's hand gripping the hospital bed on the right. In all three examples, the patient's identities themselves are out of focus. The nurse captures an almost ethereal image of her patient during the traumatic blur of a hospital shift. In other words, I wish to suggest that the formal elements of each patient's snapshot mirror the circumstances in which the nurses encountered them: chaotic, traumatic, and urgent. That's not to say, though, that these examples are not valuable and valid instances of literary caretaking. The very act of Sakal speaking about this patient is evidence that despite what little she knows about him, she continues to hold him in her memory. So too do the photographs of the two COVID patients now exist within the archive of COVID-19 more broadly, simply by virtue of Cunningham's act of testimony. In reading Sakal's account of her patient, I'm considering and inviting you to consider as well that the nurse speaker is using testimony to extend the performance of afterlife care that she mentions toward the end of this passage. By making public what otherwise would have remained private, isolating experiences, both Sakal and Cunningham extend the caring process beyond the moment in time captured in each snapshot. As I begin wrapping up, I want to acknowledge that these acts of public testimony, particularly those that openly critique individual institutions, can often come at a cost for the caretaker performing this labor. In an April 2020 New York Times article, Reporter Nicholas Kristof details many such instances of hospital personnel publicizing an institution's unsafe practices only to be terminated soon thereafter. Likewise, in an article from late April 2020, nurse and author Teresa Brown argues that hospitals' restrictions upon employees' speech, quote, relates to the continuing corporatization of American medicine, wherein the hospital's brand and bottom line take precedence over safe and equitable labor practices. It's entirely plausible that some of these COVID-19 nursing testimonies provide something cathartic or otherwise beneficial for the speaker herself, especially in the cases of Luana Rivers and Michaela Sakal, who left their respective positions before publishing their testimonies. So too is it entirely plausible that the construction of a testimony can cause pain, both psychologically as the speaker recounts a traumatic event and materially as the speaker faces recourse from their employer. In either case, COVID-19 nursing testimonies ask us to consider how their experiences as nurses during the pandemic will stay with them, how their impulse to care for their patients might continue beyond their role as nurses, and how their making public what otherwise might remain private can function as an extension of each nurse's caretaking endeavor. Thank you very much.